Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but the post-PhD job market being what it is, I am currently, as we speak, probably driving with my dog to Western North Carolina for a project. But what I'm going to talk about today, if assuming this all works out well, are the results of my work exploring the ways that hunter-gatherers interacted with landscapes during the late Pleistocene. Through the procurement and reduction of obsidian. Specifically, I'm presenting the results of a geochemical characterization of a major obsidian source and of artifacts from Mochena Borago Rockshelter. The Horn of Africa contains some of the earliest records of Homo sapiens biological and behavioral evolution. And if you've heard all of this already, I'm not sure where I fall in the presentation order, but forgive me some background. The Horn was also likely a corridor through which dispersing populations ultimately left the continent during the late Pleistocene. And for the past 16 years, the Southwest Ethiopia Archaeological Project has explored the ecological refugia that would have sheltered these populations. The Ethiopian Rift is also one of the richest obsidian landscapes in this part of the world. Nagash and colleagues recently published the first countrywide study of obsidian sources using electron microprobe. But these studies often relied on a single sample and in some cases lacked good provenience information. Many sources remain uncharacterized, especially in the South, and even fewer projects have published geochemical studies of excavated obsidian artifact sequences alongside primary toolstone sources. So we don't actually have the data we need to collect the Horn, sites in the Horn, to toolstone sources across Eastern Africa and beyond. Until recently, archaeological records and environmental proxies have been too scarce to explore the relationship between behavioral and ecological dynamics of the late Pleistocene in the Horn. Obsidian sourcing offers a window into these behavioral dynamics. Based on preliminary sourcing, we know that the Baantu obsidian quarry was an important source of toolstone for at least two major late Pleistocene sites. At Mochena Borago Rockshelter, occupants exploited the source throughout marine isotope stage 3. And at Sedicho Rockshelter, roughly 60 kilometers northeast, from 27,000 years ago onwards, Bantu obsidian was used. These obsidians likely made it to many sites in the region, including possibly the high altitude site of Fincha Habera and the terminal Pleistocene Bulbula River sites, and also perhaps even sites in the Gamo Highlands like Mota Cave. My primary goal with this project was to characterize the Baantu source itself and as much of the Mochena sequence as possible to explore variation and procurement across MIS3 and possibly earlier. Archaeologists have used energy dispersive XRF to characterize Ethiopian obsidians for many years. In these analyses, we highlight the utility of trace elements in the mid-Z range, particularly yttrium, niobium, and barium, per the work of Brown and Nash further south, and also in conversation with Steve Shackley, who's analyzed these obsidians for many years. The Baantu obsidian source is located along the southern inner wall of the Hobicha caldera, which is one of at least 9 major volcanic centers in the region. The Baantu source consists mostly of a large erosional area that formed from both quarrying and seasonal erosion downslope into the Bisaure River. Sweep first surveyed the area between 2008 and 2010 and later excavated here in 2014. What we call the Baantu source consists of both outcrops, which have been clearly mined to varying degrees, and massive scatters of artifacts and debris which have eroded from underlying outcrops and been redeposited in quarrying activities. If the heavily devitrified hand axes are any indication, this has likely been happening for several 100,000 years at least. It was actually Ignacio de la Torre who first published about this area, who suggested in print that the early Middle Stone Age artifact types represented hominin presence in the area beginning around 200,000 years ago at least. Obsidians somewhere in the Hobicha caldera have been dated to 1.5 million years ago, but we don't know about the obsidians from Baantu specifically. The deposits of Baantu mirror a regional pattern of undifferentiated quaternary alluvium, according to some geologists, but we can differentiate it somewhat. Lower unit sterile yellow sands are overlain by middle unit red-brown silts and clays, paleosols, and also erosional contacts. It's within the middle unit that obsidian lenses are eroding across the Baantu area, which is roughly 1.5 kilometer area. Upper unit sands vary and often include pyroclastics, modern soils, and coarse white sands. Mochena Borago is located roughly 20 kilometers northeast of Baantu. Again, if Steve has gone over this, I apologize, but Mochena Borago is located on the late Pliocene trachytic volcano, Mount Demota. And Mochena is one of the best dated late Pleistocene sites in Eastern Africa. It was originally excavated by French archaeologists up until 2000, and then in 2006, Sweep began studying the late Pleistocene sequence. Initial excavations were in an area called MB1, while recent excavations of much deeper deposits have been in an area called MB5. MB1 has been dated to between 49 and 36.6 thousand years ago. And lithostratigraphic units called groups describe periods of mostly in situ occupation. Some MB1 obsidian was analyzed by Andrea Warren for a BA thesis, and she suggested that almost all these materials had come from somewhere around Baantu, but Baantu was only known from a few hand samples from the surface at this point. We use her data in this study later on. The MB5 sequence is much more complicated. However, what has become clear is that this area preserves much older, more deeply stratified deposits because we don't have secure dates for this period of the occupation. We can't be sure what period we are sampling with the MB5 artifacts analyzed here, but they are all well beyond radiocarbon limits and older than 50,000 years ago. Trace element data collected in this study come from geological samples, which I struck directly from the obsidian outcrops at Baantu, which we identified in 2020, from artifacts collected in transects on the Baantu surface between 2014 and 2020, and artifacts excavated from MB1 and MB5. Now, we couldn't control for artifact type here because there were a variety of analysts and this wasn't always recorded. So this is considered a general sample of artifacts from these levels of MB1 and MB5. We then compared these data to XRF data from sources analyzed by Steve Shackley, north of the study area. All obsidian was analyzed, whether by me or in some cases previous analysts, on a single PXRF machine using an unmodified baseline calibration over 12-year duration. It was then recalibrated in 2017 using the Bruker-Mer 40 standards. Each geological sample and artifact was analyzed once, and several operators used the instrument over these 12 years, but we have eliminated as much user error as we can. What we found at Baantu were three distinct geochemical groups: the cluster revealed by the Baantu outcrops and two others, which we call unknown group 1 and 2. There's also some black chert, which somebody, not me, included in these analyses. In this figure, black dots correspond with Baantu outcrop samples and open circles are surface materials. Notice that the obsidian outcrops form a tight, well-defined cluster into which most of the surface obsidians fit. However, 4 do not and likely represent imported materials. Next, we generated an ellipse from the source data generated by the Baantu outcrops and added 4 source ellipses, 95% confidence intervals, from Shackley and Sahale's data from the north. We then compared all of these to the Mochena Borago artifacts, specifically the MB5 materials. These are the same samples, these two images. They're just two bivariate plots comparing yttrium to both rubidium and niobium. At least 22 of the MB5 artifacts are from Baantu, but 65 do not cluster with the Baantu ellipse. We call non-local something different here because in conversations with Steve Shackley, what's become clear is that this relationship between yttrium and rubidium is actually a pretty good representation of the geographic source sources relative to each other, and therefore perhaps even a source closer to the Gatamota area sources about 100 kilometers north of Baantu. Finally, reanalyzing the MB1 data, what we find is that all of these cluster with the Baantu outcrops. Now, what you're looking at here are raw counts, not parts per million. We had to do this because the original settings of the machine had the channel intensity at half of what it was later. So we had to actually count provide raw counts under a peak. You can ask Lucas about this process for both Baantu and the MB1 artifacts. And what we see here is that these artifacts cluster pretty tightly using this technique with Baantu itself. At Mochena Borago, to summarize, if earlier levels record hunter-gatherer responses to arid periods, the expansion of obsidian procurement may reflect increased mobility with embedded procurement or intensive exchange with specific distant sources, perhaps as a form of risk management. At Baantu, the unknown chemical groups we identify in this study could represent local subsources that we haven't identified yet. They may also represent artifacts brought from other primary obsidian sources. We just don't know the variety of obsidians in this region yet to say for sure, although anecdotally, there are some color differences. There are also many recycled artifacts, colored obsidians, etc., on the surface of Baantu, none of which I have seen among these outcrops in terms of green colors or these brownish obsidians that often sometimes pop up. Clearly, over the site use of the Baantu source, mobile groups were reusing and redepositing the obsidian that was circulating within larger regional networks that have yet to be studied and identified. And this this pattern of going from a variety of exotic materials to local procurement seems to also reflect a broader MSA to LSA pattern across Africa. Terminal MSA levels across the continent often preserve evidence of exotic raw material exploitation, while LSA people prefer local sources, which may signal a shift from embedded procurement with high mobility to more sedentary lifestyles, the so-called troop-to-tribe transition. But so far, we need a lot more data from sequences and with a specific attention being paid to variation within assemblages, for example, to artifact type, to tease out this variation. Future surveys in the Soto region will identify the range of sources that would have been available to people living at Mochena Borago and other sites. We will also be resampling the Mochena sequence and paying close attention to sourcing with regards to artifact type, because this can tell us a lot about variation in procurement and site use over time. These data were compiled from many previous analysts, and we treated these as a general sample, regardless of type, as I already mentioned. Finally, SWEEP has sampled a variety of volcanic ashes in the region, and our ongoing projects are building late and terminal Pleistocene ecological and geochronological records to better frame this behavioral change at a finer temporal scale. And I'm sure Steve will be talking a lot more about that. Thank you to all of these folks. Thanks to all of you for being patient with the format here. Keep an eye out for this publication. It will soon come out in the contributions of the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. This is where it will soon be published. And I will end there. Thank you very much.